Hey everybody, Miss Calabrese here. Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the cardiovascular system. All right, so your cardiovascular system is a closed system of tubes that's connected to a central pump, and that pump is your heart. So we're going to be talking a lot about what the heart looks like today and how the heart works. Um, So it's about the size of your fist, and it beats about 10,000 times every single day, and it continues to beat from the time that it's formed in utero until the time that you die. Um, the job of the heart is to pump blood, and blood is there for transport, right? We talked a lot about transport last time and how blood helps transport nutrients around the body, gases around the body. Um, helps to regulate body temperature. There's some regulation of pH that happens here and facilitate the functions of the immune system as well. Right, so where's your heart located? So it's in your thoracic cavity. It's in between the two pleural cavities in an area we call the mediastinum. Right, so the mediastinum is this region. I'll kind of highlight in yellow here, this region here between the two pleural cavities. So other things we find in the mediastinum are like the thymus gland and these major vessels that are branching off of the heart. Um, if we look at a horizontal section through the thoracic cavity over here on the right side of your screen, you can see that the heart is basically central, a little bit maybe over to the left-hand side of the thoracic cavity, and is closer to the anterior wall of the thoracic cavity than to the posterior. All right, so the heart itself kind of has a triangular shape to it. The base of the heart is going to be the widest part. This is true for any organ. The base is the widest part and the apex is the narrowest part. So even though apex means peak or top, it's actually the bottom of the heart is the apex. So the base of the heart, the top of it, we find around the second rib, and the apex is around the fifth intercostal space. All right, so the heart itself sits in a serous membrane. So we talked about serous membranes back in A&P I. Just remember that a serous membrane is a double-walled fluid-filled membrane. So the pericardium is a serous membrane that holds and protects the heart. All right, so serous membranes having two walls to them. So the innermost wall, the wall that's actually touching the heart, is called the visceral pericardium. And then the outermost layer is the parietal pericardium. And then in between the visceral and parietal pericardium, we've got fluid there that's helping to kind of protect the heart from friction that's created by constant pumping. All right, so a quick note on a clinical connection here. So pericarditis is an inflammation of the pericardial membranes. So this could happen for a number of reasons, but if you lose fluid in that serous membrane in the cavity between the visceral and parietal pericardium, then you can get a lot more friction, which can cause inflammation. And that inflammation can result in an increased fluid, right? So if something becomes inflamed, we draw fluid towards that area. And so when we increase the fluid as a result of the inflammation, that's called pericardial effusion. And that pericardial effusion, if it gets to be too extreme, actually puts pressure back on the heart itself, and it won't be able to pump so well. So that's cardiac tamponade. All right, so the different layers of the heart. So I've mentioned the pericardium being that sac that the heart exists in. That pericardium had the two layers, the parietal and the visceral. The visceral pericardium, so the innermost layer of the pericardial sac, is also called the epicardium. So epicardium and visceral pericardium are the same. The next innermost layer, as we go a little bit deeper, is the myocardium. So the myocardium is all this thick muscular wall here is myocardium. And then the innermost lining of the heart is called the endocardium. So the endocardium is just this kind of thin layer lining the inside of the myocardium on the inside of the heart here. All right, so endocardium, innermost layer, Myocardium is the middle layer that's muscular, and the epicardium is that outer layer, and it's the same as the visceral pericardium. All right, so here's a closer look at those three layers. So if we're just taking kind of this chunk out of the wall of the heart here, we can see that endocardium is a really thin layer here on the inside. Then we've got this kind of thick myocardium. And then we'll have the epicardium. Remember, the epicardium is the same as the visceral pericardium. Then we've got the pericardial cavity, so the space between the layers of the pericardium, and then the parietal pericardium, and then finally an outermost layer, which is the fibrous pericardium. That's really a tougher layer that's kind of holding everything together. Okay, so just to refresh your memory about cardiac muscle, so we talked about the muscular system in A&P1, and we talked about the differences between, say, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. Just a reminder that cardiac muscle is striated, like skeletal muscle, but other than that, there's a lot of differences here between cardiac and skeletal. One is that these cells are smaller, so they're not those super elongated skeletal muscle fibers that we were looking at. These are smaller cells. They usually just have one nucleus to them, and instead of being pushed off to the side, that nucleus is usually pretty centrally located. So we still have the striations. In addition to the striations, we've got intercalated discs. So let me highlight a few of those intercalated discs here so you know what we're referring to on the micrograph. So those intercalated discs are kind of the barriers between adjacent cardiac muscle cells. And in those intercalated discs, if we were to zoom in on them really closely, um, we could see that there are a whole bunch of gap junctions that are holding these cells together. Those are going to help spread the electrical signal across the heart very rapidly. So remember that in order to get muscle cells to contract, we need an electrical signal, an action potential. And that action potential usually comes directly from a nerve, but in the case of cardiac muscle, it doesn't work that way. So we obviously have nervous input to the heart, but also the heart is capable of autorhythmicity, which means it can perpetuate its own beat, and send that electrical signal from one muscle cell to the next through these gap junctions, through the intercalated discs. All right, so a few questions here. Where is the heart located? What's the protective covering around the heart? What's the inner layer and the outer layer of that covering? Um, and then what are the three layers of the heart? Okay, so the heart is located in the mediastinum, which is between the pleural cavities within the thoracic cavity. The protective covering around the heart is the pericardium. The innermost layer of that is the visceral pericardium. The outermost layer is the parietal pericardium. And then the three layers of the heart, innermost is endocardium, the muscular layer is myocardium, and then the outer layer is the epicardium. Okay, so let's talk really quickly about the chambers of the heart. So the heart's divided into four chambers. So you've got a four-chambered heart. The two upper chambers of the heart are called the atria. So here's your right atrium. I'll circle it here. And then your left atrium is over here. And the two bottom chambers are called the ventricles. So right ventricle over here and left ventricle over here. Right, so the atria are the chambers that receive blood. The ventricle are the chambers that pump blood, right? And now in between these chambers, so in between the two atria up here, we've got an interatrial septum. So inter means between, the atria. Septum is a dividing wall. And then in between the two ventricles, we've also got an interventricular septum, so a dividing wall that separates the two ventricles. Okay. For our discussion of the heart, we're going to divide it into a conversation about the right heart and the left heart because although their jobs are similar, they're receiving blood from different places and delivering blood to different places. So your right heart is responsible for taking deoxygenated blood from the body and sending it to the lungs. Right? So that's the right heart's job. The right heart takes blood from the body that's been deoxygenated. So the cells of your body have sucked all the oxygen out of that blood. They've loaded it up with carbon dioxide waste, and they're going to send that deoxygenated blood back to the right heart, where it will enter the right atrium, go to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle will send it to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. Now, the left heart, his job is to receive blood from the lungs, so he's receiving fresh oxygenated blood and sending that out to the body. Right, so right heart receives blood from the body and sends it to the lungs. Left heart receives blood from the lungs and sends it to the body. All right, so we're going to kind of go in order and talk about the order in which blood flows through the heart. So we'll start with the right atrium. So again, the right atrium is where you're receiving blood from the body. So this is deoxygenated blood that's arriving from all over the body, and it's going to enter into the right atrium through a few different vessels. Um, those vessels are going to include the superior vena cava, which is this large blue vessel up here, inferior vena cava, which is this blue vessel down here, and then in addition to those large vessels, you'll also receive deoxygenated blood from another vessel called the coronary sinus. Coronary sinus enters the right atrium from the back, so it's kind of hard to see from this perspective. But just know that those are the three vessels that feed into the right atria and that are supplying the right atrium with deoxygenated blood. Okay, so those are all those three vessels again. So again, blood, superior vena cava is draining deoxygenated blood from the upper body, so from the arms and the head. The inferior vena cava is bringing deoxygenated blood from the lower body, so the trunk and the legs. And the coronary sinus is bringing deoxygenated blood from the heart itself. So remember, the heart itself needs blood because it's living tissue. And so the deoxygenated blood coming back from the heart tissue comes in through the coronary sinus. So all three of those vessels enter into the right atrium, and then the right atrium will push that blood down into the right ventricle. All right, so that's what's going on here. So right atrium over here, push us down into the right ventricle. All right, so we go from the right atrium to the right ventricle. There is a valve that separates those two structures. So the valve that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle is called the tricuspid valve. It's called tricuspid because it's got three flaps to it, or three cusps, so tricuspid. All right, so we go from that right atrium through the tricuspid valve, we get into the right ventricle. Now the right ventricle, you'll notice, is a little bit bigger than that right atrium, and it's got thicker walls, and that's because when the right ventricle contracts, when it squeezes, it's got to send blood to the lungs. Right, so whereas the right atrium, all it had to do was send blood down to the ventricle, that wasn't very far. The right ventricle has to send that blood to the lungs. So right ventricle will squeeze, pump that blood through. It's got to pass through another valve. This next valve in order is the pulmonary semilunar valve. So we go through that pulmonary semilunar valve and into the pulmonary arteries. And those pulmonary arteries split. Well, we get a right pulmonary artery and a left pulmonary artery, and each one of those goes directly to the lungs. Right, so here's that pathway again. Right, so we'll review it from the top. So we've got superior vena cava up here, inferior vena cava down here, all entering into the right atrium. Right atrium then pumps that blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is then going to pump that blood up into the semilunar valve. Pulmonary semilunar valve is this one right here. So we go past that pulmonary semilunar valve into this area, which is called the pulmonary trunk, and then to the left pulmonary artery, right pulmonary artery, and eventually to the lungs. Okay, so once this blood goes to the lungs, it's going to drop off carbon dioxide and it's going to pick up oxygen. So as it leaves the lungs, it's going to flow through a series of pulmonary veins. So pulmonary arteries took us to the lungs. Pulmonary veins are going to bring us back from the lungs. So these pulmonary veins You'll have four of them, two on the right, two on the left, and they all four of those drain into the left atrium, which I'll circle here. So left atrium is where we're re-entering the heart now after making a stop at the. All right, so left atrium is receiving blood from all four pulmonary veins. So all that now freshly oxygenated blood that just came from the lungs is going into the left atrium. The left atrium is then just going to push the blood down a little bit into the left ventricle. So to get into the left ventricle, we have to cross another valve, and that valve is called the bicuspid valve. It's also called the mitral valve. So you might hear it called both things, bicuspid or mitral. All right, so left atrium through the bicuspid into the left ventricle. All right, so that left ventricle, now we're looking at it kind of a top view down. So looking at the left ventricle, we can see here that that the myocardium of the left ventricle is very, very thick. Right, so this is much, much thicker than, for example, the right ventricle, which is on the left side of your screen here. So left ventricle, much thicker, much larger than the right ventricle. And the reason for that is the left ventricle, when it contracts, when it pumps, it's got to send blood all the way throughout the rest of the body. Right, so this is fresh oxygenated blood that just came from the lungs. When it gets into that left ventricle is going to squeeze and send that blood all throughout the rest of the body. All right, so here's a review of those last few steps. So as we leave the lungs, we enter the left atrium, we go through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. And again, the left ventricle is this really thick-walled structure, very powerful muscle here. When he pumps, when he squeezes, he's going to go through the aortic semilunar valve, so that's our next doorway. So the aortic semilunar valve is the last doorway we have to pass through before we get to the aorta, right? And your aorta is the largest blood vessel in your body. So this is a very, very large artery. It's receiving all of the oxygenated blood that's leaving the heart, and it's going to branch into smaller and smaller arteries and take that blood all throughout the rest of the body. All right, so there's your pathway again. So we're entering in through the four pulmonary veins into the left atrium. We're going to go through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. Then we're going to go through the aortic semilunar valve, which kind of dips behind the pulmonary trunk here, go up through the aorta here, and then eventually out to the rest of the body. All right, so I'm going to go through the pathway one more time here just to make sure that we understand, because you will need to know this pathway in order and understand how blood is being moved around the heart. So blood enters into the heart from the superior and inferior vena cava. So superior vena cava from the top of the body, inferior vena cava drains the bottom part of the body. Those two large vessels plus the coronary sinus bring deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. The right atrium then, when it contracts, when it squeezes, will push blood down through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. The right ventricle then, when it squeezes, will push blood out through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries. Those pulmonary arteries then enter into the lungs. And in the lungs, they're going to drop off carbon dioxide, which you then exhale out, and they will pick up oxygen. So now the oxygenated blood leaves the lungs. It takes the four pulmonary veins back to the left atrium. The left atrium will contract and push that blood down through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle squeezes, it's going to send blood out through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, which will then branch into smaller and smaller arteries, taking that blood throughout the rest of the body. All right, so make sure that you're studying that pathway and that you're able to kind of recite in order how blood flows through the heart. All right, so a few questions here. What chambers receive incoming blood? What chambers pump blood out of the heart? Which side pumps to the lungs? Which side pumps to the body? Where do we find the tricuspid and mitral valves? And where are the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves? Right, so here's your answers. The receiving chambers are the atria. So the atria are always the ones receiving blood, whether they're receiving it from the body or the lungs. The chambers that pump blood out of the heart are the ventricles. So ventricles are always the pumping chambers, sending that blood either to the lungs or to the body. Which side pumps to the lungs? That's the right heart. Which side pumps to the body? That's the left heart. Where are the tricuspid and mitral valves? Those are the two valves that are going to separate the atria from the ventricles. And where are the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves? Those are the ones that separate the ventricles from the large vessels exiting the heart. So pulmonary semilunar valve separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk. Aortic semilunar valve separates the left ventricle from the aorta. All right, so I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.